Our reading this morning is taken from Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 to 30 and 36 to 43. Jesus tells the parable of the weeds. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seeds in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed ears, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let them both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Then he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the Son of the Kings of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is at the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of the Father. He who has ears, let him hear." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Today's reading from Matthew is no doubt familiar to many of you. At first glance it appears simply to be continuing straight on from the parable of the sower, with its metaphor of seed planting. But this parable, which appears only in Matthew's Gospel, adds something extra by introducing the presence of an enemy, the evil one, to Jesus' listeners. The presence of evil in the world is something that challenged Jesus' listeners in the first century and continues to challenge us in the present day. Why should God, who is all-powerful and known for his goodness, allow evil to exist? Let's unpick the parable of the weeds and see what it has to say to us. First of all, weeds. Weeds can be perfectly good plants in and of themselves, but growing where they're not wanted. Dandelions, for example, which are completely edible, but are wild rather than cultivated, are considered to be weeds by most people and can mess up the plans of many gardeners. Other weeds are wild plants that have no value. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous 19th century American philosopher and poet, is known for his smart comment that a weed is but a plant whose virtues have yet to be discovered. Foxgloves are an example of a plant that grows in the wild, which looks wonderful in the back of a border, sets seeds in places where it isn't wanted, and could be both fatally poisonous if eaten and has significant medical benefits. Digitalis is used in medicine to regulate the heart. The seeds sown in our parable are described as darnel in some Bible translations. Bearded darnel, which was known in biblical time as tares, is a weed that has no virtues at all. It could be described as the devil of a weed. Its roots surround the roots of the good plants, sucking up the precious nutrients and scarce water, making it impossible to root it out without damaging the good crop. Above ground, the darnel looks identical to wheat until it bears seeds. And these seeds can cause everything from hallucinations to death if they are eaten. But what about the enemy, the challenge I mentioned earlier, the presence of evil in the world? As Jesus explains in the second part of the reading, the enemy is the devil whose children are the weed seeds. It is the introduction of evil that makes this parable so powerful. Jesus clearly acknowledges the reality of evil. His parable illustrates evil's pernicious nature, underscoring both the necessity of eradicating it and the difficulty of doing so. There are almost certainly few in the congregation who do not know what Jesus is talking about. Sometimes our own lives resemble the farmer's weed-infested field, with weeds and wheat entwined in our souls, hearts and minds. Sometimes it's big things like debt and addiction, but other times it may be more subtle, as in the countless distractions we let derail us. Facebook, email, phone calls and endless meetings can make us appear busy working on the realm of God, but they may simply be symptoms of our own divided souls. Procrastination is a fault of mine, and sometimes I find myself doing all sorts of unnecessary tasks when really I should be focusing on a job that needs to be done, that seems to be potentially difficult. Sometimes I spot what is happening and give myself a real good talking to. But sometimes it takes a while before I pluck up the courage to get started. And of course it's rarely as hard as my mind was telling me. Our jobs and working lives can feel infested and under assault by the evil one. Like the servants in the parable, we may face the challenge of separating the weeds from the wheat in our workplaces. For example, a manager who is pleased for his company's profits, but less sure about the bookkeeping behind them. Or a teacher facing a group of parents whose well-meaning criticism chokes out his creativity and care for his students. These people may not be first-century Galilean farmers, but they confront evil every day. And we hear that Jesus does too. Just before he tells this parable, the Pharisees, leaders of his own faith, try to trick him and begin their plot to destroy him. They look like true leaders, but they are as false and as deadly as any bearded darnel where Jesus is concerned. Our Gospel writer and Jesus also know that evil can infest the community itself. Elsewhere in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus warns against false messiahs and false prophets, those who cry, "Lord, Lord," and seem faithful and caring, but who lead people astray and harm the community. At one point he refers to ravening wolves who come to you in sheep's clothing, people who appear to be one thing on the outside whilst being something very different inside their true selves. Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus to the religious leaders for a bag of gold, appeared on the outside to be an ordinary man like all the other disciples. But deep down inside he clearly had evil or the love of money in his own heart. In reality, there are people of every type in every community and every community of faith. However, before we rush into judgment, we must hear the cautionary note Jesus includes in his parable in the voice of the Master. It's not easy when the seeds first sprout to tell weeds from the shoots of the good seeds sprouting alongside the weeds. In trying to root out the weeds, it's very easy to take the good seedlings at the same time, to damage them. And the servants in the parable were keen to sort things out straight away. But the Master shows true wisdom. The Master has a strategy. These words of restraint prevent untimely decision-making, which might have bad consequences. This waiting is not wasted time, but is both wise and intentional. In our impatience to pass judgment, we often want to bring matters to a head and so determine who is good seed and who's a weed. But the God that we catch a glimpse of in this parable models for us an infinite patience that sets us free to get on with the crucial business of loving, or at least living with, each other. Often in the space created by such patience, it is not just others, but we ourselves who are changed and welcomed into a larger reality. This is the sense in which we are reborn, not just once, but over and over again. This picture of a blessed mixture of wheat and weeds growing together until the harvest is not just a glimpse of the faithful church in our own time, but is finally a glimpse of future judgment at the end of time as we know it, the end of the age as Jesus refers to it. The text points us to a God who does not merely tolerate endlessly an ambiguous world that is a mixture of good and evil, faith and faithfulness, triumph and tragedy, but who finally, in God's own good time, acts both to judge and to redeem the world. Christians believe that for the sake of this hurting and impatient world, and through Jesus Christ our Lord, God's realm will at last be completed and revealed in all its fullness. Meanwhile, this realm is thriving in us, around us, and even miraculously sometimes through us. And God is pleased to let all of it grow together until the harvest. Until then, it is our job to imagine everyone as belonging to this God, and therefore to try with every bit of energy we can muster to endeavour to take on board, through Jesus Christ our Lord, God's holy and intentional ambiguity.